You ever notice how the most interesting admissions in royal commentary rarely show up in the headline? They show up buried in the third paragraph, almost as an afterthought, right before the piece pivots back to the safer, more familiar narrative. That's basically what happened recently when royal commentator Catherine Meyer made a comment that, if you actually sit with it for a second, is a pretty big deal. She acknowledged that Harry and Meghan had a genuine, rare ability to connect with younger audiences. Not spin, not a backhanded compliment. An actual acknowledgement that they brought something to the monarchy that the institution doesn't really have anywhere else right now. And then, almost in the same breath, the conversation slides right back into the usual explanation that the real issue was Meghan simply not understanding royal hierarchy. Which, if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, is a strange pairing of ideas. One statement says they had something rare and valuable. The other says the problem was her. Those two things don't sit together as comfortably as royal commentary usually pretends they do. So today we're going to sit in that gap for a while and actually ask the question everyone tends to skip past. Was hierarchy really the heart of this? Or is that the tidy explanation people reach for because the real one is a lot messier? Stick around, because we're going somewhere with this. And if you're into royal commentary that actually slows down instead of just repeating the headline, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you're going to want to be here for where this goes. Let's start with what Meyer actually said, because it's worth taking seriously rather than skimming past it the way most coverage does. The acknowledgement that Harry and Meghan had a unique pull with younger audiences isn't a small thing to admit in royal commentary circles. This is an institution whose entire long-term survival depends on relevance with exactly that demographic. Younger audiences aren't watching royal ceremonies for tradition's sake the way older generations might. They're engaging through social media, through documentaries, through the kind of modern, personality-driven storytelling that the monarchy has historically been slow to adopt. The institution has spent years trying to modernize its image, trying to find ways to stay culturally present instead of just historically respected. New social media strategies, more candid interviews, documentary access it would never have granted a generation ago. And here you have two of its most talked about, most searched, most globally recognized members walking straight into that exact demographic gap, filling it almost effortlessly, and then stepping away entirely. So when a commentator openly says, yes, they had that, it's not just a passing compliment. It's an admission that something real was lost, whether or not the person saying it intends to frame it that way. And that's exactly what makes the follow-up explanation so interesting to examine. Because almost immediately the conversation shifts to Meghan didn't understand the hierarchy, as if that single framework explains the entire departure, start to finish. It's a clean, tidy explanation. It fits neatly into a story the public has heard many times before. Outsider comes in, doesn't grasp how things are done, friction follows, exit happens. It's simple, it's digestible, it requires no institutional soul-searching, and it conveniently avoids a much messier set of questions about media treatment, about how the institution handles modern fame, about whether hierarchy was really the core issue, or just the easiest one to name out loud when a journalist asks for a quote. Because here's the thing about hierarchy as an explanation. It puts the entire weight of the story on one person misunderstanding a system, rather than examining whether the system itself was equipped to handle what Harry and Meghan actually represented. Every institution has hierarchy. Every family business, every corporation, every long-standing organization has some version of how things are done here, some unwritten rulebook that new members are expected to absorb by osmosis. The interesting question isn't whether hierarchy existed. Of course it did. It's a centuries-old monarchy. Hierarchy is basically the operating system. The interesting question is whether hierarchy alone explains a departure this seismic, this global, this defining, or whether it's being used as a stand-in for a much more complicated tangle of factors. Tradition colliding head-on with modern celebrity culture, an intense and often brutal media environment, and an institution that may not have fully understood what it had until it was already walking out the door and boarding a plane. This is where the Diana comparisons inevitably come up, and for good reason, because the parallels are hard to ignore, even if you try. Diana, too, had an almost unmatched ability to connect with the public in a way that felt different from the rest of the family. Warmer, more relatable, more culturally fluent for her era. Someone who could walk into a hospital ward or sit with people the institution usually kept at arm's length. And Diana, too, existed inside an institution that struggled to know what to do with that kind of magnetism, surrounded by a media environment that alternated between adoring her and tearing her apart, sometimes in the very same week, sometimes in the very same newspaper. The comparison isn't about claiming history repeated itself exactly, beat for beat. The circumstances are obviously different in significant ways. It's about noticing a pattern. The monarchy has, more than once, had a member who resonated deeply with the public and simultaneously created friction within the institution. And more than once, the explanation offered afterward by insiders and commentators alike has been simpler and tidier than the reality actually was. And that brings us to the media environment specifically, because you really can't talk honestly about Meghan's time in the royal family without talking about the coverage that surrounded her. Whatever your opinion on any individual decision she made, it's hard to look at the tone and sheer volume of coverage during those years and call it a neutral, even-handed press environment. That's not a fringe opinion floating around one corner of the internet. It's been documented and discussed extensively, including by royal reporters themselves, who've since spoken about the intensity of that period. So when the explanation for the departure gets simplified down to she didn't understand hierarchy, it conveniently leaves out an entire dimension of what was actually happening around her. The intensity of the media scrutiny, the palace's own communication struggles and reported delays in defending her publicly, and the broader question of whether the institution had any real playbook at all for someone who generated that much modern global attention, both good and bad, all at once. There's also something worth noting about timing and expectation here. Meghan didn't arrive into the royal family as a private, low-profile figure easing into public life the way some past spouses did. She arrived already a known actress, already fluent in the mechanics of media, already carrying an existing engaged fan base. That's a fundamentally different entry point than the institution was used to managing. And instead of that being treated as a potential asset to be shaped and integrated thoughtfully, a lot of the public narrative around her early years framed that existing fluency and confidence as a problem, something to be corrected rather than something to be worked with. It's worth asking whether that instinct to correct rather than collaborate is part of what Maya's comment is quietly gesturing at, even if it's not stated outright. So let's actually sit with the bigger question the situation raises, because it's a genuinely good one. If Harry and Meghan had this rare, openly acknowledged ability to connect with younger, more global, more modern audiences the monarchy has repeatedly and openly struggled to reach through traditional means. Why did their departure become such a defining, damaging moment? instead of functioning as a wake-up call about how to better integrate that kind of relevance going forward. Could that popularity have been treated as an asset worth building around, rather than a disruption that needed to be managed and contained? Did the institution simply not have the flexibility, the structure, or maybe even the willingness to make room for a different kind of royal presence? One built more on modern relatability and cultural fluency than on rigid protocol and precedent. These aren't rhetorical questions we're going to pretend to answer definitively, because honestly, nobody outside that inner circle has the full, unfiltered picture, and anyone claiming total certainty either way is probably overselling it. But they're worth asking directly instead of letting hierarchy quietly absorb all of that complexity on its own. Because that's really the core tension running through all of this. Hierarchy is a real thing, it's not made up, nobody's arguing the monarchy doesn't have structure. But it's also the explanation that requires the least institutional self-reflection. It puts the burden entirely on the newcomer to adapt, and effectively none of it on the system to evolve or examine its own blind spots. And when you place that explanation next to an on-record admission that Harry and Meghan had something the monarchy visibly struggles to replicate elsewhere, that rare cultural reach, the two statements start to sit a little uncomfortably next to each other. One says they had real, tangible value. The other says the problem was her not fitting in. Both can be partially true at the same time, that's entirely possible. But treating the second one as the whole story, the tidy final word, is where things start to feel like a genuine oversimplification of something much larger. So where does that leave us? Not with a tidy conclusion, because this genuinely isn't a tidy situation, and anyone offering you a clean, complete answer in under 10 minutes is probably skipping a few steps. It leaves us with a more honest set of questions than the ones usually asked in royal coverage. Not simply, what did Meghan do wrong, which has been asked and re-asked for years, but what did the institution potentially lose, and did it fully understand what it was losing while it was actually happening, or only in hindsight, once the departure was already public and irreversible? That's a very different conversation than the one that usually gets aired on this topic, and it's one worth having honestly, without immediately reaching for the simplest available explanation, just because it's the most comfortable one. So, did we settle the great hierarchy debate today? Not even close. If anything, we just found a new, slightly more complicated question hiding behind the old simple one, which, if we're being honest, is basically the entire genre of royal commentary. Every answer just unlocks 3 more questions, like some kind of cursed advent calendar that never actually gets to December. But if you stuck around this long, you clearly enjoy digging past the headline instead of just nodding along with it, so you're exactly who this channel is for. Let us know in the comments. Do you think the monarchy actually lost something valuable here, or is hierarchy doing a lot of quiet heavy lifting in that explanation? If you enjoyed this one, like the video, subscribe to Sussex Unfiltered and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. And if you want to support the channel directly, super thanks are always appreciated and help us keep doing this kind of independent commentary instead of just repeating the press release version of events. See you in the next one.